Thank you, Justin. Next, we welcome Bruno Aziza, who's the head of data analytics at Google. Bruno has worked across businesses ranging from startups to large enterprises and everything in between, including with some pretty analytics heavy organizations like Microsoft, BusinessObjects, and Oracle. Currently, they're at Google, helping them on their journey and exploring what data mesh means for them. The title of this talk is Data Mesh, What You Need to Know to Make It Real. So we welcome Bruno to the stage.
Whether you like it or not, and I'm guessing you like it because you're here, the term data mesh is gaining incredible popularity. Now, one of the benefits of being the last presenter today before Zamac closes the event is I can try and provide you some guidance and perspective on the amazing information you learned today and the amazing information you're going to read about this term on the internet and public forums and so forth. So this talk is really about how to use all this information in order to make the data mesh a reality for your organization. Now, before we get started, I want to invite you to connect online. Today is just really the beginning of a conversation that I hope we can have across the many channels at our disposal. I've been in the space for what feels like an eternity, and I've studied the concept of the data mesh for a very long time. My first exposure to the data mesh was as a practitioner when I was working in France, helping retailers deploy these distributed systems a long time ago before people called them a data mesh. And since I've been here in the US, I've really had the opportunity to work with amazing organizations, small, medium, large companies, worked with vendors like Microsoft or Oracle, SAP Business Objects, small companies that I helped launch, Sisense, at scale, Alpine Labs, which is now TIBCO. And I'm at Google today where I run outbound product management for data analytics. That's products you might know like BigQuery and Dataproc and Dataflow and Dataplex and many more. And as such, I've had the opportunity to work with incredibly innovative organizations. I'm going to share some examples with you today. So hopefully you'll find some learnings that you can take action on at your organization. Now, there are three ways that we can stay in contact. The first way is, of course, going to social channels like LinkedIn, where I post a lot of content, and then you can connect with me there. I also write for Forbes and VentureBeat, so you're welcome to leave comments there and let me know what you think about what I'm sharing, on Medium as well. And then finally, you'll find me in 2 weekly programs, one sponsored by Google Cloud called Data Journeys, where I share conversations with customers and try to share their best practices. And then finally, every Sunday, I do what I call my CarCast, where I give you the latest and greatest announcements and really highlights of the week. And it's called CarCast because I do it from my car. So hopefully we can connect, and hopefully I can make this session as entertaining and as helpful as I can so we can continue this debate and advance, of course, this topic of the data mesh. Now, one note, I work for Google, but this presentation is really representative of my thoughts and my opinion, so let's get started. Now, people ask me all the time, what should I be worried about this concept of data mesh? And surprisingly, in my opinion, the concept is not what you should be worried about, is how the concept is being communicated and by whom. My observation has been that there's at least 3 types of camps when you look at the term data mesh, and I call them the 3 Ds of the data mesh. The first D is for disciples. These are people that really have spent a lot of time reading Jamac's paper and really trying to understand, okay, how is this different from what I've seen before? And those are the folks that I would tend to go to as much as I can because they've really spent a lot of time kind of studying the theory to start with. There's also the second D, which I call the distractors. And these are folks that maybe are attached to older principles and they'll tell you, hey, look, there's nothing new here. That's really kind of difficult to believe because if you look at the evolution of technology over the last 2 decades, we've made a lot of progress. The cloud, serverless concepts now enable us to do things that are clearly different from what we wanted to do or could do 10 years ago, maybe even 5 years ago. And then finally, the third D is for the distorters. These would be folks that would tell you, hey, you know what, if you like this term, well, buy my product or buy my service. In this industry, you might have heard this many times before, and then we know that often, that's not true. It's really kind of almost impossible to believe that with one product, one service, everything will kind of be solved at once. So I would kind of try and think about how the information is coming at you, think about the 3 Ds and try to figure out, okay, which box does it fit in? So you can kind of decide how you pay attention to these debates because, none of these debates on semantics and who gets credit for what idea really are going to help us make the data mesh actionable and real for your organization. Because the truth is, when it comes to the state of the current data architecture, despite the fact that our industry is at this point has invested millions, maybe even billions of dollars and euros and yens and British pounds and Swiss francs. Any CIO and chief data officer that I talk to, and I ask them how they feel about the data architecture, well, this is what they tell me. It feels like it's very uncomfortable. It's not really connected, and it's not really agile. It's not really easy to use it as a platform for innovation. Now, we all know, of course, that the sheer volume and exponential growth of data is staggering, right? Just every organization has invested heavily in technology to try and extract value from their data and try to gain competitive edge. But the hard truth is that less than a third of organizations today are able to achieve transformational business outcomes with their data. The industry is really struggling to get value, to connect these two things, data and value. When you drill into why this is happening, there are really kind of three reasons that we see. The first one is that as companies are digitalized, and digital transformation certainly has been accelerated for some by almost a decade in just a few years, these organizations, of course, are experiencing incredible large amounts of data, but it's not the volume or the growth that's the problem. It's not just that, it's the unpredictable nature of it. Every company of every size in every industry is starting to realize that there is no such thing as small data anymore. In fact, there might not be such a thing as big data either. What's happening is it's unpredictable data, unpredictable size, unpredictable growth, unpredictable type. And we don't know how quickly it's going to come at us, but we know that when it does, we want to have the capabilities, organizational capabilities, and technological capabilities to take advantage of that opportunity. And the reality is, even though the adage is opportunities come to the prepared, the reality is that very few organizations are actually prepared. Now, why is that? Well, we know that if we try to repeat the past, we're going to continue getting the same results. And we know that the answer is something different from what we've done in the past. You look at the data lake projects, as Zhamak highlights it in her paper, they aim to drive scale, reduce cost, but quickly they have become a nightmare to administer and manage, and they fail to engage our people, our end users. The traditional cloud data warehousing projects, they're great ideas to move to the cloud to provide more agility, but they really provide performance at small scale, some flexibility, but they also fail to provide an easy path of innovation through machine learning and artificial intelligence at scale. Each of these approaches, in fact, created more silos. And instead of providing the performance, the scale, the agility to organizations, they ended up, in fact, reducing our ability to innovate. So it's really about how do we build for innovation, not just from a technology standpoint, but from an organizational standpoint. Along the way, we've also learned that every machine learning problem is, in fact, a data problem. And that by compartmentalizing workloads, we're in fact limiting our ability to innovate. So you take the example of machine learning, business intelligence, data science, on any data, structured, unstructured, spatial, analytical, transactional, batch, real-time, all these workloads are currently kind of stuck in their own silos. And so the question is, how do you organize yourself so they're fluid and you can work through them in a very natural way, if you will? And the companies that understand that and the companies that are able to apply principles for that, they are the ones that are able to out-innovate their peers, as you can see in this research here, sometimes 2 times, 4 times faster than the rest of the industry. And then finally, and probably more importantly, is our people. Our data strategy needs to take into account how people experience this data. And of course, you can think about, platforms that you build, but it's really about getting information in time to people so they can recognize them, work with them, and maximize impact around this idea of real-time by design, so they can build products ultimately like real-time personalization and recommendation. We'll talk a little bit about this concept of data products in a little bit. But the point is that the innovators, the disruptors, the leaders in our industry, they've been able to organize themselves around this opportunity, not just from a technology standpoint, but from an organizational standpoint, which I think here is probably one of the biggest contributions of the paper, is how do you organize yourself from an organization standpoint? Now, so it's not surprising that when you go out and kind of look for leaders that have succeeded with the data mesh, like the example of L'Oreal here, you read that the first step is to think about team topology, team organization. In fact, this blog here that I really want to advise you to go take a look at is a blog by François Nguyen. He's the Chief Data Officer at L'Oréal. And in his first blog, he talks about the step he takes for team organizational structure. How do I optimize for productivity? How do I optimize to make sure that my domains work together and they also work to the central organization? So this idea of centralization, decentralization in this first blog you'll read. And then the second blog is actually about how technically he's implemented that. Francois is someone that I really want to point you to because he's a great leader who's done a great job sharing his knowledge and I think can help the rest of the community. L'Oréal is not an isolated case, by the way. If you look at patterns of organizations that are succeeding with a data mesh, you should take a listen to this interview by that I did on the data journey of Delivery Hero. This is an organization that is a large organization focused on delivering food across a very extended network. So there's a lot of localized use cases. And you'll hear that the company has really built the data mesh on a few key principles. The first one is this idea of the data owner and the responsibility of the domain to contribute. So it's really an important concept as you hear and listen to the video. The second thing is the allocation of resources at the domain level. And this really touches on financial ops. Do you have the ability to not just give technical capabilities for the domains to be effective, but are you able to keep track of cost and budget at the domain level? And then finally, governance, the importance of having a fabric. So it lets you innovate at the edge while you can apply central policies, regardless where the data sits. That's really an important concept. And hopefully, as you listen to this interview and read the blog, you'll be able to kind of glean some knowledge that you can use at your organization. So we've talked about what to be worried about. We've kind of got a couple of examples here that we can go out and read about how you can get success. The question is now, how do you data mesh and how do you do it right now? Well, the worst advice that anyone could give you is tell you there's an easy button to it. Like I said earlier, in the last 3 decades that I've been in technology, I've heard the story many times of like, hey, look, there's one product, one service you can buy. But you know what's been true about that statement is 100% of the time it's been wrong because there's no easy button. This sophisticated new concept, and it requires new technology, new approaches, and new attitudes. And my observation working with organizations that have been able to succeed is that they think about it as the maturity concept. And in fact, they're realizing that the data mesh is not at the beginning of their maturity and is not at the end of their maturity. You know, they think about it as a 3-step process, and in the middle of this process is the data mesh. Let me take you through it, and hopefully it provides you with a mental framework so you can use that at your organization. The first stage, which some organizations actually call the data ocean. If you Google that, you'll find that the chief data officer at Vodafone coined that term a few years ago. And the idea for why the data ocean matters here is that it's the idea of being able to see all the data across your data estate. You might have data on premise, you might have data in the cloud, you might have data in multiple clouds. Do you have the ability to see all that data and catalog it the minute it's ingested? Do you have the ability to think about data in analytical workloads, data across transactional workloads, and bring them together so you can see kind of what's going on across your data estate? The reason for why I like this term, the data ocean, is because if you think about the data lake concept, what's great and comfortable about data lake concept is that data lakes are landlocked. You can see the end of it, but you know that the reality of your data is that it never ends. And that's kind of the idea of the ocean. The data that you might need might not actually be stored by you, it might be stored by your partners. And so having this idea of data sharing capabilities and data exchange is also a big part of this phase where you're able to kind of build your ocean, at least the visibility into your ocean. This is the technical foundation that you must have in order to be able to move to the next stage of innovation around the data mesh. Now, organizations that talk about deploying the data mesh, you know, the first thing that they worry about is this idea of centralized governance and financial ops, right? And the first stage is really about optimizing for reduced cost and optimizing for reduced maintenance, right? So the concept of cloud and serverless is really important there. The stage in the middle is really about people. Should have central teams that are serving distributed teams, should have domain teams that are completely independent, or should have a mix of the two. And what do I do about my policies? Are they centrally managed and distributed? And so this is where the idea of having an intelligent data fabric strategy is really important because you can then tackle those issues. This is where having a universal semantic layer technology is really important, because you might build the applications that you want to have logic on that is now being leveraged across the organization. If you Google the example of Fidelity that talks about data neighborhoods, for instance, you'll see kind of how they've orchestrated towards that. You might hear the example of Carrefour that talks about data hubs. They've actually evolved so much that they now have created hubs that is data that they can use with their partners outside of their own organization. It's a really interesting way of kind of evolving, if you will, almost beyond the data mesh. And once you have done that, you now have the opportunity to go to the next stage. Some organizations call them the data factories. This idea of being able to now build products that leverage both the technical foundation of the data ocean with the organizational foundation of the data mesh. So now you can become a data company, and you can build recommendation engines. You can build fraud detection applications that now repeatedly are being executed into development, into production, and back into development, so you can iterate and then really build these products that now are a true differentiation to your organization. So thinking about these three phases, I think, is really important, because it allows you to break down the problem into smaller chunks, but also kind of focus on what are the drivers for each phase. And the data ocean is really about cost management. In the data mesh, it really is about management of policies, management of budget, management of enablement, and being clear on roles and responsibility. And in the last phase, it really is about repeatability, where machine learning can come in and really enable you to build these data-rich and intensive applications that are intelligent for your organization. So you might think in the data ocean that maybe a lake house concept might be very relevant. And then you might think that in the data factory, a customer data platform, for instance, might be a really important product that your team needs to be able to build. In the last stage, the role of the chief product officer becomes really important, because now you're treating data just as a component of your products. Now, I can't go into a lot of details on it today because we're limited by time, but what I do want to point you to is organizations that I started talking about that you can learn from. So when you get access to the slides here, you'll be able to click on the links of these logos, so you can go to resources and videos of these organizations that have a lot to share with us across these three phases. Now, what's great about this model is that you can be in all three phases at the same time. You might have pockets of your organization that are more mature than others. And so don't think about it as a sequential model. Think about it as a way that allows you to kind of break up the problems and having this constructive debate with your organization on what is it that we're focused on: cost management, distribution, federation, governance, or this idea of now building a muscle around building data products. Now, there are reasons for why you probably shouldn't do a data mesh. And what I want to do here, point you to a very, very useful blog that I did not write, but that I think is really interesting. I've not spoken to the author. He actually happens to work for Google, but he published this on Medium as a result of his observation of working with customers. And I think that's why this blog really resonated with me, certainly, and anyone I've shared this with, is because it's rooted in customer truth. And the author spends a lot of time with customers, so it makes a lot of sense. I can't cover all the 10 rules of why you're not ready for the data mesh, but at least I want to point to a few because I think they're important ones for us to reflect on. Reason one is probably one of the most important ones is, are you operating at a scale that requires decentralization, that makes sense, if you will, to decentralize? Now, you have to ask yourself, right? This is very subjective to your organization size, organizational challenges. Are you at a stage where your organization maturity kind of justifies decentralization and decentralization? And here I said size, but I didn't mean size of organization. I mean size of the problem, maybe size of the data. I don't think there's a magic number here where I could tell you with X number of employees, you should go to data mesh, or maybe you shouldn't. I think here there's small organizations that have lots of data and distributed business and distributed customers, and they might need it more than large organizations that have smaller footprint, if you will. So you got to decide for yourself. Take a look at this first rule, and remember, as the author states here, that effective decentralization requires centralized coordination to align, enable, and support the decentralization of your data team. So ask yourself, is the juice worth the squeeze? That's really kind of the bottom line of this first rule. I think it's an important rule and important reason. If we skip rule number 2, I'm going to go straight to reason number 3 here, is that Do you treat your data mesh as a technical solution or as an operating model that continuously evolves around over time? That's a really important question for you and your team. As I said earlier, this is not a technical solution. The core goal of the data mesh is to enable your organization to leverage data to more effectively adapt to change and more rapidly meet your demand, your customer needs. So as such, the data mesh, as I said earlier, is not the end. It's a means to an end. So I would think about it that way, and I really would double down on what is the operational model? How do we organize ourselves? The best way to structure this evolution process is to kind of follow a maturity map like the one that I showed you with iteration cycles. And as you'll see on the next slide, I'll share with you some resources on data mesh design patterns, and they'll help you kind of break up this complex problem into maybe more focused use cases so you can start deploying them using the concept of the data mesh. And then finally, when you read this blog, you'll see reason 9 and 10 that I think are really pointing to important considerations. The idea that distributed ownership cannot result in lower security, privacy, and compliance standards. You have to make security part of everyone's daily task instead of testing it later on at the end of the process. This is an idea called a shift left, if you will, and this is true for data governance. It must shift left, particularly now you're dealing with distributed metadata. So really this idea of privacy, governance, security needs to be embedded in everything that you're doing. There's a lot in this blog. It's a great blog. I really want to point you to it and then even connect with the author so you can ask him questions and even suggest maybe your thoughts to him. Ultimately here, we're all here to learn from each other, so I'm sure he'll appreciate that as well. Another person that I want to make sure you know of is a fellow called Eric Broda. Eric Broda is a practitioner. He's done a lot of these projects and implementing data mesh successfully, and he's built a lot of content around this concept of data mesh architecture patterns. You can see here he's dealing with enterprise data catalog and event streaming, and you can read again, it's free resources on Medium that you can access, and then of course you can Google to find the titles here, and make sure you connect with Eric as well. Ultimately, what we're trying to do here is to help each other as these new concepts are becoming nascent and being adopted. We want to do everything we can to learn from each other. So if you've got anything to suggest to me, this is a way to get a hold of me easily. You got my email, you've got my LinkedIn. I hope that I'll see your comments on my daily or weekly updates. I hope you'll find this session worthy of your time and that you'll share it and then let me know what you think about it. I want to thank you for your time, and back to you, Jamak.